Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of MFS's Let's Talk Property podcast, where we connect industry experts to explore an array of topics within the dynamic world of property. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to take a minute to share a quick disclaimer. MFS are a bridging loan and buy-to-let mortgage provider and are not financial advisors. The opinions and views expressed in this episode are personal to the host and guest and may not reflect the views of MFS. For more information on MFS, you can find us at www.mfsuk.com and be sure to keep up to date with our podcast updates on Instagram at MFS_LTP. Now let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Let's Talk Property podcast. Today I'm joined by Dee Cooper. Diving right in, Dee, can you tell me a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so I work with supported and assisted living providers, as well as councils and housing associations to help with the situation where temporary accommodation is a problem, homeless people on the street, people fleeing domestic abuse, that sort of thing.
Okay. And what made you sort of make the leap into that, and what maybe did you do before that?
Yeah, so I was in the trades business before.
Okay.
So I was a painter and decorator by trade. And
That's a big switch.
Yeah, big switch. And always wanted to do something in property. And I've also got a bit of history of working with children with learning disabilities, physical disabilities as well. So I wanted to bring both together. And I think about 4.5 years ago, I just took the plunge and decided to go ahead with it.
And was there like one particular moment that you thought that, or was it just a...
Yeah, my life got changed. I was in a high-speed car crash and got injured with lifelong injuries from it, unfortunately. So I couldn't go back to painting and decorating. Yeah. So I decided to use my contacts in the property industry, get it educated and do something that was worthwhile giving back.
Brilliant. And what kind of sort of clients do you work with? And sort of how does that...
Yes, so I work with mainly adults. Yep. Adults with learning disabilities, complex needs, autism, and then obviously the homeless, domestic abuse, people that are really in a situation that they're either on the streets or they're like sofa surfing, that they've got nowhere to live.
And I take it, sort of taking that one sort of step further, then that will, depending on what client you're working with, that will determine maybe what type of property you're looking for for them. Yeah. And obviously from that point of view, does that sort of make it a challenge then to find the right type of...
Yeah, I mean, it's quite clear in the respect that where I work with the individual care providers or the housing association councils, councils and housing associations are a little bit more broader, but with care providers, they're quite specific at what they need. So most of my providers will say they won't use flats, they won't use HMOs, they won't use new builds. It's like 3-4 bed detached properties, purely because they've had experiences in the past where if they've used terraced or semi-detached, and because of these adults with the complex needs, they could lash out, they could be noisy, through their conditions.
So I suppose if you're in a high-rise flat or a HMO,
it causes issues with neighbours.
Yeah.
So over time they've worked out and they've sort of niched down what they want, and they'll say to me, right, we need it near a local bus stop because some of the care providers care workers don't drive. It needs to be a fairly quiet area, but local amenities, that sort of thing. Yeah. So they're very specific at what they want. It needs car parking, it needs safe enclosed gardens because obviously they could escape and things like that. So that's sort of, and I tend to work with the providers and say, what do you need? And we really niche down on what they need, so it makes my life easier.
And that's, I suppose, key to finding that property then. And I suppose the sort of next question you've sort of just touched on there is when you're working with providers, is there a specific sort of way that you'll work with them, or is it all tailored to sort of individual?
Yeah, so it is quite specific, but it's not normally specific to an individual. Yeah. There are times that it will be, and they'll say, right, we need this extra or we need that extra. But because most of the time they have the same sort of adults with the same sort of needs. And they, for example, like we took on one recently in Luton where it was a 5-bed detached, it was a big living area, and they said that's okay because we're only put 2 individuals in, but we need 2 carers in the day, so 1-on-1.
Yeah.
And then they'll have 24-hour care, so they'll have 1 carer overnight, for example. So they won't have loads of people in one property. They have to do it gradually, and they have to integrate them gradually.
Yeah. What you sort of touched on it at the beginning with regards to sort of working with disadvantaged children, things like that. Why did you sort of decide to focus on the supported living and the temporary accommodation side of things?
Yeah, the supported living, I've got a nephew who's autistic, severely autistic, and he's in an assisted living property, and I know how hard that was for them to. They had the funding, but to actually find somewhere that was suitable for him, that was in sort of the area that his parents lived. I mean, he literally lives down the road from me, actually, and even I wasn't aware that was a supported living property. So you could literally walk down the street and you don't even know these properties exist. And then my best friend, she's mentally ill. She's got paranoid schizophrenia. And I know there was times where she was sectioned, and then she was just literally, after maybe 3-4 months of being sectioned, she just straight away put in the community. And if she didn't have her parents to rely on, she'd have nowhere to go.
Struggle with that.
And it's just such a shame.
And obviously, you've been doing this now for quite some time. What's sort of your main goal in terms of your work, and sort of what do you hope to achieve in this? Or what do you think we can achieve in this in this space?
I mean, ideally, I want to be able to collaborate with more people who are passionate, who have the same sort of ideas as me, that maybe are slightly behind me in education and things like that. That they know their local area, and I can say, this is what you need to do. Go out and find it. And eventually want to be able to push it across the whole of the country, because there is a need across the whole of the country. It's not just where I live. And I can't do it alone. No. Me alone's not going to make a difference. So if I can work with other people that are as passionate about, and they have to be passionate. If it's just, we're just in for the money, it's just not going to work. And eventually I want to be able to do some commercial conversions, so bring my refurb team into it, be able to get the commercial conversions, and ideally I want to focus on accessible properties as well, because there's not enough disabled accessible properties in the social housing as well.
Now we work with it. It's always intrigued me, sort of the property sourcer sort of side of things. We work with private property sources that not in terms of maybe the social housing or the temporary. So it's really interesting to hear that. I'm always interested in, what does a sort of typical day look like for a property sourcer?
Yes, so I mean, I've been a property sourcer for years, like working with investors and stuff as well, so that's a big difference. But my general day is scrolling through like Rightmove and Zoopla and all of those, speaking to agents, speaking to the care providers, speaking to the housing associations, councils, and then booking viewings if it's something that works for them. So I'll provide them pictures, videos, all the information. Yes, it's got local amenities, it's a quiet area, all that sort of thing, so I know it meets their needs.
Ticks the boxes of what they've...
And then if they're happy, normally we book the viewing within a day, go and view it, and then, I mean, we did one yesterday, literally come out of the property, they were happy, put an offer in straight away.
And is the offer, obviously with Rightmove they have the price, is that something you negotiate, or do you take it to a certain point?
Yeah, so what I do is I will take it all the way through to collection of keys. So I will obviously discuss with the provider what they want to put in. Like with this one, they went above market price because there was another company interested, and they were like, we don't want to lose it. And because obviously it's funded, it's not like LHA rates where you're capped at a certain amount. When it's funded, they're exempt rates, so they can go above market price. and we just put it in. Unfortunately, we lost the property, but that's how quick they want to turn it around.
It can move, yeah. And I suppose leading into that, you know, one of the things that sort of I find is you've sort of touched on it there, but what type of challenges then do you face when trying to source a property? You know, and is there anything that you think can be done? You know, because when we're talking about things like temporary accommodation, and we've touched on obviously the types of clients that we're looking to put into to these types of accommodation, is there anything that could be done to make that process a lot easier? So in terms of the challenges that you might face, but then on the flip side, is there something that could be done within this space to make it more accessible or make it easier for
I think
for people like yourself to find these
it
properties?
is difficult at the moment because the rents are so high. There's not enough supply, there's over demand, so you are then fighting against normal tenants. Agents sometimes don't understand the supported living. They'll just go, oh, it's another company we don't want to work with them. So it's building those relationships for me, for them to be able to bring me properties that haven't even come to the market. So it just gives us a little bit more breathing space to go, right, okay, I send that straight to my provider. My provider will go, yeah, we want a viewing, or no, this doesn't work. And then that will make our life a lot easier, because we don't have time, and we can lose the property really quickly.
And obviously, are you coming up against them private investors and things like that? Because again, for me, when you're thinking about sort of, as I said, sort of the temporary accommodation side of things, you know, to work with maybe local councils first, or give them an option to, okay, well, what does this look like? Is that not available at the moment? It does just go out to market, and it's you know, the highest bidder wins sort of thing. Is that the case?
I've been trying to work with the local councils recently, and it's really, really difficult because they can't pay enough to meet the rental.
So it's funding again, does it?
Funding, and then you're getting a lot of landlords where they've had problems in the past where maybe a council tenant has trashed their place, stopped paying the rent, things like that. So it's trying to work with those landlords to educate them, to say, right, okay, we can stop these problems, or we can try. But it's getting the councils to understand it as well, to say you need to be able to give some sort of incentive for them to take on an AST and a short hold tenancy.
And they're not willing to. Is that a barrier that you find at the moment? They're not willing to do that.
I think it's because the councils are really strapped for cash, and I think it's really difficult for them at the moment, where they've spent out a lot of money previously on temporary accommodation, and they've wasted that money. And then, like, certain councils have gone bust, certain supported living providers have gone bust because they've overpaid on certain things. So now they're sort of cutting that, but then it means there's more people need housing.
And has that been in more recent years with the changes in the property market, the Bank of England base rate increasing, you know, things like that? How's that sort of affected?
It's really making a difference, especially in the rental market, because what's happening, some estate agents are actually saying, right, we want 6 months or we want 12 months rent up front.
Right, okay.
So maybe first-time buyers or people that can't afford to get a mortgage, they're then using their deposits to be able to pay that. And we can't obviously do the same. Although we get funding, there's only a limit that you can actually pay up front.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? You know, we've had conversations over the past sort of 12 months about rates increasing and an increase of rates to a point where it doesn't become, I suppose, viable for investors or developers to, you know, to even put a spade in the ground to get it going. And obviously, at the time, rents weren't really following suit. So you've got somebody on a 12-month AST or a 24-month AST that's on a rent of say £500-600 a month, but their rate, you know, the rates have doubled in that period. Exactly. So it's trying to find that, you know, that sort of balance. I mean, has the sort of change in market made you think I need to change my way of working, or have you just sort of kept the same type of
that's the other
approach?
reason I went into supported living, was because there's always going to be demand for housing. There's always going to be people on the streets, there's always going to be people that are fleeing domestic violence, and there's always funding. So I don't think, regardless of whether the market is bad or the interest rate, it doesn't really affect that sector. But it does affect investors, and then that then can have a knock-on effect, because there might not be so many investors that are investing.
Well, private investors obviously run those as a business. You know, we see it day to day with portfolio landlords, things like that. You know, if the yield's not there on a certain property because now the rates are 8, 9, 10%, whatever that might be, but they're only getting a yield of 11%, it doesn't quite work. I mean, does it help the fact that you're based in and around London? Does that make it easier or harder, given the sort of property value or rental? Or, you know, if you could come back to Manchester, would that make it easier for you? Would that make it?
I think major cities are always going to be the tough one, because there's always going to be such high demand. The rental prices are much higher. I mean, I used to work as a sourcer in Manchester, and I used to do serviced accommodation, and it just gets so oversaturated in the end, and it just gets really difficult to find those properties. And then if a landlord or a agent has had a bad experience with the company, they'll just go, no, don't want to speak to anybody that's running a company, regardless of whether it's supported living. They just won't listen. And I think that's the hardest part, and probably that's why I tend to stick a little bit more outside of London. I do work in North London, and I am trying to branch out a little bit more, but it is much more difficult.
Makes it more difficult. Given the and I think one of the things that sort of I've found in recent times, and we've done a lot of sort of educational bits about, you know, the lack of housing, you know, within the UK, and obviously the need for more, especially around social housing. And as you touched on, you're in the middle of a cost of living, and everything seems to be going up. And as you touched on, you've got people saving for properties, maybe first-time buyers that are having to use deposits to cover rent and things like that. Do you see any sort of solution? I mean, my view is, I think that, you know, as we move forward, we're going to have a lot more sort of HMOs, a lot more multi-units. I think as we move on, we're probably going to be living in smaller spaces, but sort of similar style, sort of maybe higher rise, you know, building up, because even though the property's not there, the space isn't really there in some of these cities that people still want to live in, and sort of surrounding areas. I mean, is there anything you see with?
I think like empty retail units. I have heard in the pipeline that they are trying to push for that you can convert the retail units as social housing only, which would help bridge that gap, really, because they're empty anyway. Most of the towns are dead since COVID. So I think, I mean, I know in my town they're like building into the airspace, so like two levels, which they can do on permitted development rights, which makes life a lot easier. But I think, like, I mean, I couldn't even count on two hands how many retail units are empty in my town, which if you converted those into, even into small apartments, or even room only, maybe with kitchenettes, that could house so many homeless people. And
obviously you've not got the new development sort of premium on that.
Exactly.
So with just the refurb, if someone was able to go in and acquire that for a certain price, you've not, you know, with a lot of the new developments, even first-time buyers or shared ownership and things like that, it can be still, you know, even to buy 50% of one property, it can be still quite expensive for the you know, for the everyday person. So if you have more schemes like that, I think it'd really open that up. One of the other questions that I had was, is there a typical sort of deal for you, like, or it sort of, as in our world now, this, I always say there's no such thing as a straightforward transaction anymore. There's always a quirk after things like COVID and all that sort of stuff. There's always a quirk, whether it be with security or client or whatever that might be. Is there a such thing as a typical deal for yourself?
It can be sometimes, like if I'm working with one particular provider and they're quite strict on their criteria, it can be quite easy, especially to find them. But then you could have issues with the agent, you could have issues with the landlord. I mean, my last agent I worked with, they just were so slow.
In terms of?
Just not, like I was chasing them constantly every day. Have you done this? Have you done that?
Right.
Have you done this? Have you done that? And it was just constant. And I just thought, it's not that difficult to just do your job.
I suppose speed does play a key part when you're trying to, you know, as you touched on before, if you've got a third party that's trying to buy the same property or buy the same security.
We delayed on completing on that, or well, not completing, but to get the keys on that because of everything that was done slowly. And when you've got the funding, they need to be in a certain time, because obviously you've got to integrate, so you could put one person in and then maybe you have to wait a couple of weeks before you can put the second person.
Right.
So that then delays everything.
Okay, so there's an integration process whenever you put in, and that might be assisted living or supported living or anything like that. So you wouldn't just, you know, 6 bedrooms, 6 people in, you don't, okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah, because of their needs, they have to adapt to the new surroundings. And if you put in a second or third person in at the same time, it's just too much for them to cope with.
Okay.
And they can just freak out because of it. So you've got to be very careful of the way you integrate them.
And the timing's probably crucial and things like that.
With that one, that was a 5-bed. We can only put two adults in. So we can't fill all of those 5 beds because there's just too many in the one house with different needs.
And then how does that impact from sort of maybe a rent, you know, if you've got sort of...
Yeah, so I mean, they will fund, because there's exempt rates, the council will fund whatever's needed.
So they'll make up
so they'll make up the shortfall
to keep it so they're comfortable in where they're living.
Yeah.
And I mean, if at all, sort of how do you see maybe your business or business in general being affected in the next, 6 months? We've got a general election on the horizon. Do you see that affecting sort of maybe, if not your bid, but property in general?
Yeah, I think...
I mean, you always have that uncertainty before.
Exactly,
and then you have maybe like the Boris boom of 20, afterwards. So I'm interested to see how that... But do you see that?
I think it will, as far as investors. I think investors will hold back a little bit before knowing what's going on. As far as us, as far as rental, I don't think it's going to make much difference. I mean, we may get more funding, which obviously would be good, especially in the social housing. I think, obviously, depending on who comes in, I know a couple of the parties have pledged 150,000 social housing units. I can't remember which ones, but I know there was, I think, 2 that have... I was reading something from Shelter.
Right.
And they were saying that the more that can pledge that, the better it is for everyone, really.
Because I know they were trying to do that alongside building more GPs and all that. Because again, I have this conversation quite a lot. When you're building more and more in these properties, you have to think about, well, what else do you need in terms of maybe education, GP, that kind of thing. So I think it's important that they focus on that. Yeah. Whoever gets in, and that is something that we'll, I suppose we'll have to see over the next sort of 4 weeks or something that it's going to be. I mean, before you go, we often sort of like to do a quick fire roundup of the end of episode, and just for our listeners out there that are or may want to be involved in property, what 3 pieces of advice would you give someone wanting to get into the same type of business as yourself? Yeah, I think you've got to be passionate about it. You've got to have a reason behind doing it. I think there's a lot of people out there that
whether it be deal sourcers, and they're just thinking, oh great, we can jump on this, we've got loads of money in the temporary housing, accommodation, or we can just provide any property to any supported, and it just doesn't work. It has to be specific, and I think maybe a little bit more education, whether you get a mentor or whether you do courses, speak to other people that are doing this already, because you can learn from the mistakes. I think it is just understanding it fully, because you will make mistakes. Even me, I'm still making mistakes now, and I'm constantly educating myself. Like last week I was on a day course for supported living. I've just taken a 12-month mentorship in supported living, so I can then start taking my own properties, be able to refurb them and then give them out. So I think that is the main things.
And would you say understanding both sides as well? So not just understanding what type of properties you look, but understanding the people you're sourcing properties for. What one thing I've taken from today is the specifics. So the person you're sourcing a property for, whether that be an assisted living or temporary accommodation, they all seem to have a specific type of property that they need. So it's not just a case of firing in 20 properties to them that don't meet the needs. So it's understanding that side as well, would you say?
I mean, like I've been trying to educate some sources. Like I get it all the time. Sources just contact me. Oh, I've got 30 flats, or I've got HMO, and I said, but you don't get it. It has to be specific, and you can't put 30 special needs or complex needs adults in 20 flats. It doesn't work. The most you'd be looking at maybe 6 units, 8 units, and they would have to have individual rooms. They couldn't be mixed. And I think that it's just educating people to understand that it is specific criteria. You need to, like, even I know people that have approached providers and they'll go, oh, I've got this property, this is perfect supported living. As I go into a provider and they're all say, oh, what properties you got? I said, no, I haven't got properties. What properties do you need?
You're almost working backwards.
So you're working backwards.
Rather than, I've got all these properties to show you, but they might not actually fit the needs of each
And it's
provider.
wasting my time and it's wasting their time as well. So I think you're better off understanding their criteria fully, and then I can go, right, I know when I go on to Rightmove, I want 3 beds above or 2 beds above, has to be detached, or it has to be semi-detached.
But with any new people then, have you sort of got to that point where you sort of know going in that what kind of stuff
pretty
you sort
much,
of get to that point where you'll sort of know what they
unless they're a totally different, say for example mental health, you could put more people in, so that might be slightly different, but with the complex needs, adults with complex needs especially if it's 24-hour care, you pretty much know. Like I go to a property now and I know exactly what they're looking for. Can't be on a main road because it's not safe. I mean, one we're looking to take on is a gated community. It's got full CCTV on the outside so they can see if somebody's walked out. They literally can't get out of that property. So it has to be safe. So
Safety is the main
it's the main thing.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dee. Really appreciate it. Just for our listeners out there, where can they find you? Socials, things like that? So
I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook as Dee Cooper. I think Instagram's Dee Cooper, Dee Property or something like that. But you can pretty much find me on any platform. I am on TikTok, but I don't really understand it very well, so I'll be honest.
None of us do.
I'll leave that one. I'm not so sure about that one.
Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate and share this episode. You can access our previous episodes in all the usual places, as well as on our website at www.mfsuk.com/podcast. You can also stay connected with us on Instagram at @MFS_LTP. See you next time.